So welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this panel discussion entitled The Future of International Cooperation. My name is Sami Zaidan, senior presenter with Al Jazeera International. It's my pleasure to be the moderator for this session. This discussion is the third session, actually, of the Imperative of the Future series of talks organized by the Sharq Diwan initiative. Let me explain what the Diwan initiative is. It's a bi-weekly online talk exploring the post-pandemic world and featuring prominent figures, intellectuals, and activists engaging with ideas which are shaping our world. So for those perhaps new to the forum, allow me to introduce its activities too. Al-Sharq is a non-profit organization working towards informed citizenry, democratic participation, inclusive dialogue, and change in the MENA and beyond. It consists of three main pillars, we could say. The Al-Sharq Strategic Research Initiative, it's a think tank focusing on long-term research, promoting the ideals of the forum. Al-Sharq Academia, that's an online platform for equipping activists and those interested in public affairs with courses relevant to a Sharq region in fields of social sciences and humanities. Al-Sharq Youth, a network of active youth committed to leading change in an inclusive and just world, with active hubs around the world and integrated programs focusing on youth and civil society empowerment. You can get more details if you head online to youth.sharqforum.org/programs. I'd also like to remind everyone to please complete the UN questionnaire. It'll be available in the chat box, and this is a questionnaire the UN is using in a consultative process to gauge perspectives and opinions about key priorities and challenges from civil society and youth around the world. So please make sure you avail yourself of that opportunity. Let me present our distinguished panelists in tonight's event. We're honored to have three distinguished panelists who will address us on the challenges of international cooperation and multilateral institutions in an era of rising nationalism and isolationism. Let me introduce them to you then. First, we will hear from Mr. Fabrizio Hochschild. He's the United Nations Under-Secretary General and Special Advisor to the Secretary General on the commemoration of the UN 75th anniversary. We will then hear from Mr. Robert Malley, President of the International Crisis Group. He also served as Special Assistant to US Presidents Barack Obama and Bill Clinton. And finally, we'll hear from the President of our Sharq Forum, Mr. Waddah Khanfar. Mr. Khanfar previously served as the Director General of the Arab world's leading television network, Al Jazeera, during the critical and turbulent years we'll all recall of the Arab Spring. Well, each of our distinguished speakers will address us for 12 minutes, after which we're going to open up the event for questions and answers from the audience. So please do take notes during the address, jot down any thoughts that you might have for further discussion. We'd love to hear from our online followers once we get to the Q&A session. So without further ado, let me now hand over for 12 minutes to our first speaker, Mr. Fabrizio. Mr. Fabrizio, I think we can still say the floor is yours, sir, even though we're in the virtual COVID era.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here, to be with you. I have to say, a little unaccustomed to be on an all-male panel, but hopefully the next event you'll do of this sort will be all women, so there'll be you'll get the virtue of truly inclusive perspectives. I'll say a few words about how we, from our tower here on the East River in New York, see the state of multilateralism and how we believe it may evolve in the months to come. And the UN 75 initiative that we've launched, and which you very kindly shared one avenue for participation with those who have joined the meeting, our 1-minute survey, is of course about trying to make sure that the post-COVID multilateralism goes in a direction that meets the aspirations of we the peoples. So I think even before COVID, it was apparent that we were facing a fundamental and very dangerous contradiction that with COVID has only grown more acute. And that contradiction is this: an ever-growing number of global challenges in an ever more interdependent, ever more interconnected world, challenges that can only be resolved through international cooperation, and at the same time, a retreat from the methodology of international cooperation and reduction of support for the mechanisms set up in the aftermath of the Second World War to better handle international challenges. And of course, what we see is increased unilateralism and increased trends of fragmented alliances of like-minded states. And of course, unilateralism, bilateralism, like-minded alliances of like-minded states all have their legitimate role in international politics, but they are a poor instrument for dealing with truly global challenges. They will always be inadequate. And of course, what I'm thinking about when I talk of the growing number of truly global challenges, thinking first and foremost of climate change, which is, if you like, a slow onset pandemic, but much more deadly, much more devastating in its impact than the COVID pandemic. I'm also thinking of growing inequality in 2 out of 3 countries across the world in the last 3 decades. Inequality has grown worse, despite the advances we've made in reducing poverty. I'm thinking about protracted conflicts. Conflicts are lasting longer, as Rob and others has documented through the ICG, and others have done likewise. I'm thinking of demographic trends, unprecedented numbers of youth, proportions of youth populations in some parts of the world, and unprecedented proportions of ever elderly growing elderly in other parts of the world. And I'm also thinking about the disruption of new technologies. Technologies have turned a corner. In our lifetimes, most of technological advances we saw were incremental, ever faster cars, ever smaller music players. The technological change now is transformational. It's no longer incremental, and it brings many advantages. And the very fact that we're having this event online is one indication of that, but we're also seeing many downsides. Now, these are all challenges that no country, however mighty, however rich, can manage. And some of these challenges have been made worse by the pandemic. There's no doubt that the pandemic has exacerbated inequality. It's disproportionately affected minority populations. It's disproportionately affected those who in normal times lack inadequate access to healthcare and are poorer. The economic fallout will also affect those whose jobs can't go digital. It will affect those kids who cannot go online to continue their schooling. So the pandemic will exacerbate inequality. And even though the pandemic, in terms of headlines, has displaced conflict, has displaced issues around climate change, protracted conflict has not stopped. The number of responses to the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire has not been negligible, but it has not had the change, the radical change effect that we had sought. And climate change, as we've seen from some recent statistics around warming in the Arctic and Antarctica, has continued unabated. And we've seen other aspects, new technologies. The digital divide has grown also greater with the pandemic. And then the pandemic has not only made existing global challenges worse, but added to that list. It's also notable that the pandemic itself, apart from its exacerbating effect on existing challenges and adding to the list, has placed a particular strain on the business of international governance, on the business of international cooperation. And this for three reasons. I mean, diplomacy by definition, and multilateral diplomacy in particular, is a contact sport. It does not work well through Zoom. It does not work well through WhatsApp messaging and calls. Diplomats depend on getting together, having coffee, having drinks, talking in the corridors. And the formality and scheduled nature of our contacts in the digital, in the lockdown mode, make diplomacy much more difficult. The second burden that is added is an economic one. Countries inevitably, economically and politically, have grown more inward-looking. They're dealing, for the most part, with major domestic crises. The bandwidth, the energy they have, and the economic resources to invest in international endeavors is inevitably diminished. And we can take it for granted that, at least with regard to resources, as many countries are going into massive debt in order to pay for healthcare, unemployment as a result of COVID, that burden will be with us for some time. And then the third aspect is that it has enhanced geopolitical tensions. And we see this. You know, one could think, some people speak of COVID originally as the sort of threat from outer space that would truly unite the world. But of course, it's not being treated like a threat from outer space that makes all countries come together to come to their senses in order to try and secure the best common result. No, it's being seen and treated and spoken up and framed very much along the lines of pre-existing geopolitical tensions. So how will we come out of this? I think there are three things that can be said, and then the rest is speculation. First, I think what can be said is that the future is very uncertain. I don't think anybody knows how we'll come out of this in terms of multilateralism. Secondly, I think we'll see multiple trends. I'll outline three options, but I think the truth is that the future will hold a combination of those options rather than one dominant direction. And third, I think we'll be in a state of flux and uncertainty for some time. I think the new normal, whatever that means, will be evasive and not be with us. The new era, whatever that looks like, won't be with us for some time. So what are the three possible options when it comes to multilateralism? I mean, reading the literature, I think one can break it up into three trends. One is that multilateralism will suffer a major setback and we'll just see increased isolationism, increased nationalism, growing distrust between countries, and fragmented alliances of like-minded states. And we see much of that already. In the digital domain, it's very clear. The second option is what some have referred to as modest multilateralism or mini multilateralism. And that is a downscaling of the current ambitions of multilateralism and a refocus of it on the most important global common goods. So, for example, a steer away from international trade regimes towards much more domestically managed economies, but at the same time stepping up our efforts on climate change and maybe on pandemics, but a more restricted, more focused multilateralism than what we have today. And the third and most optimistic scenario is a reinvigorated multilateralism with, like after previous crises, after the First World War, we had the birth of the League of Nations. After the Second World War, we had the birth of the United Nations. So often crises help people to come to their senses and try and reorganize to make things function better. So a redefined, a reinvigorated, or to use the Secretary General's phrase, reimagined multilateralism, but a multilateralism with more teeth, more inclusivity, and better representative of the power structures of today rather than what we had before. Now, which way we'll go in, I'm not sure. I can say, and we've listened now to over 300,000 people in 193 countries, that if you go to We the Peoples, they would like to see reinvigorated multilateralism with a focus on climate change. There's no question of that. That is the overriding priority. Other priorities are less conflict, more human rights, better access to healthcare and education. That's coming across in all the work we're doing. I do think what will change, and this is a very personal observation, and I'll conclude with that, is that when the UN came into being 75 years ago, or in fact a bit longer, the UN came into being in a meeting in Washington in January 1942, chaired by President Roosevelt with Churchill and the leaders of the USSR and China. And then 4 men sat in a room and decided to create the United Nations. 22 states, other men followed suit a few days later, and that number of 26 grew to 50 by the time of the San Francisco conference in June 1945. So even though it responded to universal aspirations, universal fears, the fear of a new world war, and universal hopes of peace and security, it was very much a top-down approach. I believe that today it doesn't quite work that way anymore. I think if we look at the movements, the changes that have happened, and I'm thinking of Fridays for the Future, Black Lives Matter, the Me Too campaign, it's really much more bottom-up, it's much more grassroots. And that's why we're also reaching out to We the Peoples to try and put the future of multilateralism much more in their hands, because I do believe it is a more people-oriented multilateralism that will ultimately decide whether it's a viable project or not. I think the aspirations are there, but I think the political leaders are not necessarily well connected always with those aspirations. So thank you very much. That's a little bit our perspective, no doubt nurtured a little bit by our optimism, but I very much look forward to hearing other views.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio. There's absolutely nothing wrong with a bit of optimism, I think, in these days of dark COVID. You've raised a lot of issues, so I want to remind particularly our audience, our online audience, to make your notes and jot down your questions for when we come to the Q&A session. Just a reminder, once again, of course, you can send in your questions either through the chat box or by raising your hand. There is a button on Zoom where you can actually do that. And if you press the hand button, we'll know you want to ask a question. Let's invite our next speaker then. As I said, Mr. Robert Malley will now address us for 12 minutes. Over to you, Rob.
Thank you. It's good to be here with you. Well done with you, Fabrizio. And Fabrizio just covered so much that it's going to be hard to add anything. But I want to divide my talk into 3 parts. So I'm describing the old, the order that we're exiting from, the so-called liberal draft order, the transition phase we're in, and then like Fabrizio's trying to speculate a little bit about
Sorry, Rob, can I ask you to get a little closer to the mic? We're having a little bit of difficulty hearing you clearly. And
okay, I'll try to, if I speak louder, is that fine?
That's much better, thank you,
sir. Okay, sorry. So anyway, so I said 3 parts describing the old that we're exiting, the transition we're going through, and then some speculative words about the future that we are heading towards. So the first point I'd make about the old order, the multilateral order that we are exiting, I think, it would be a mistake to be too nostalgic about it and to paint it and to view it with rose-tinted glasses. I spoke about the international world order, the international liberal order. It wasn't particularly international. We know that it was benefiting some at the expense of many, and that many didn't really have a role in shaping that order or in deciding in what direction it would go. It wasn't particularly liberal, if you in the sense of the word. Not much liberalism around if you look at the state of the world between the Second World War and today. And it wasn't really orderly if you look at the numbers of conflicts and wars that have been covered from Vietnam all the way to Iraq. So I think the first step is to not look back and assume that what we're leaving was for some reason something that we should only have expressed regret about. Many countries were on the receiving end of that order, which was dominated for the most part by the United States and its allies, again, at the expense of many. So there was, what came with it was a degree of stability, a degree of predictability, but also a lot of inequities, a lot of violence, a lot of conflict, and a sense by many actors, both within countries and countries themselves, that they were excluded or marginalized by the order. So yes, there were elements of multilateralism, and the UN is one of them. But even the UN, as Fabrizio knows well, has gone through many periods of paralysis due to great power competition between the Soviet Union and the United States, and again, was not able to act in the way that its founders had hoped for back in the 40s. So, but what's clear is that that's an order that's being left behind. And so part two is the transition. We're in an interregnum, and by definition, an interregnum is a period of uncertainty, of instability, of unpredictability, in which there are either no rules of the road or the rules of the road are being contested and challenged, in which the hierarchy of power is up for grabs. The US is in relative decline. It still is by far the most powerful country militarily and economically, but it's in relative decline, and China is in relative ascent. And then you have a number of countries that are, we could call them middle powers, that are trying to assert themselves, either because they want to protect themselves in this vacuum, or they want to try to take advantage of the vacuum. But the fact is, and the Middle East is a place that I know of particular interest to the Sharq Forum, but obviously it's a place where we see that perhaps most vividly. It's also a period, and Fabrizio explained it, and that's preceding COVID. It's a period where we at Crisis Group were detecting more isolationism, more nativism, more inward-lookedness, less interest in multilateral diplomacy. All of that had preceded COVID-19. And as is the case with many crises, COVID-19 accelerated pre-existing trends rather than created new ones. And again, everything that we've seen from the great power competition to more countries that are more inward-looking, in which they have fewer resources, less time, less attention span, less bandwidth to devote to international crises or to multilateralism, where more countries are saying, well, we need to protect ourselves from the outside rather than work with external actors because of the scarcity of resources and the need to protect things like the food supply chain. So I think we're seeing a lot of what we were seeing before, only more so and in an accelerated fashion. And again, Fabrizio mentioned some of the examples, but the debate or the contestation over Secretary General's call for global ceasefire, which was a very laudable initiative, but gets stuck at the Security Council with the US blaming China and China blaming the US, neither one of which really stepped up to the plate. Very different from the role, for example, that was played during the time of Ebola. And we're already seeing, but again, it preceded COVID-19, but we're seeing it in even greater intensity. Countries are not prepared to devote the resources to diplomacy. We're seeing now, again, as was mentioned, harder for diplomats to travel, harder for peacekeepers, for mediators to do their jobs, harder to find the resources to cover all the enormous needs that are going to be created as a result of the pandemic and the attendant economic crisis. I believe the UN has received less than 2 billion of the over 6 billion that it said it needed as a humanitarian response to COVID. And that's just one slice of what, as I said, we're going to see in terms of scarcity of resources, scarcity of attention, scarcity of time that's going to be spent on the conflicts and that are in need of multilateral or at least international attention. And likewise, what Fabrizio just said, this is not an equal opportunity pandemic. It's hurting poorer people in all countries, and it's hurted poorer countries more for all the reasons that one could imagine. And so again, the sense of an unequal international system also risks being exacerbated by the pandemic. So if you look at, for crisis group, what we look at is what's the impact of these trends on conflict, international conflict and crises. For the most part, what we've seen, and we've seen this now for years, and again, exacerbated by COVID-19, is less of a sense of diplomatic efforts to try to resolve conflicts, whether it's in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya, in Venezuela. And instead, we are seeing countries that are either ignoring those conflicts because of the reasons I mentioned earlier, or trying to use them to press their individual parochial interests, or using them to try to thwart the advances of others. And again, if you look at what Turkey and Russia are doing and Iran are doing in Syria, what Turkey and Russia again, and the UAE and Egypt are doing in Libya, what's happening in Yemen between Iran and Saudi Arabia, what's happening in Venezuela between Russia, the United States and others. In all these countries, in all these crises, it's the same dynamic of either trying to advance your own material interest, political interest, or trying to thwart those of your competitor. And I think we are likely to see more of that in the months to come, particularly under the Trump administration, although I would emphasize that a lot of these trends predate Trump and will survive him, even if Joe Biden is elected president next November. But I think we're going to see in the next few months more efforts by the US to unilaterally try to undo the nuclear deal with Iran and create a crisis with Iran, try to change the terms of reference for the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we are going to see more of that in the months to come. Now, that doesn't necessarily preview what's going to be the future. And that's the third part of what I want to talk about. And again, as Fabrizio said, this is all a matter of speculation. What we do know is that it's going to be a new order. It's going to, or a new something, because order may not come for some time, but it's going to be a different set of rules with a different set of power relations, with a different set of actors that are going to try to come to the fore. It will be radically new, which doesn't necessarily mean much worse. As I said, let's not be too nostalgic about the past, but that it is something uncertain in which there still is a lot of room for actors, government and non-government, to shape that future. So we could say what we're hoping for. Again, Fabrizio mentioned three very interesting potential for the future. We could say what we hope for, which is that it is going to be a more inclusive form of multilateralism, more equitable and more representative, where countries that didn't fare so well after the second, or in the wake of the Second World War, are going to have more of a role to play. And it may well be that it's an order in which some actors are going to have to play a bigger role than they have in the past, whether it's multilateral institutions like the UN, whether it's non-government actors like Crisis Group or others, whether it's the grassroots organizations that Fabrizio mentioned, and which are a new feature of this landscape. So just a few thoughts on what are some of the elements that could come out of this new multilateralism. First, let's not ignore what already exists and which will survive. And the UN is one institution, and there are elements of it that may well survive as they worked in the best instances when great power competition didn't stymie them. Peacekeeping missions in the Sudan, that P5 tensions didn't block. Monitoring mentions efforts to get more aid to a country like Sudan. Or, and I think we really should thank the efforts of the UN and of Fabrizio in particular on issues like trying to build new space around digital cooperation, climate change, security, areas of cooperation which, as he said, may well not fall victim to the new power battles, global competition that are taking place, that the UN and others could carve a niche of areas where that form of multilateralism can survive. But then there are other forms that I think we have to be attentive to, and at Crisis Group we're trying to invest in because they may be part of the wave of the future. Regional organizations like the African Union, in places where the UN may be stymied, and when you don't have a coalition of other actors, regional organizations, and the AU is already showing that in an issue like the GERD, the Nile River Dam, or other places where you may find other regional organizations being able to step up, not have the same blockages that exist at the international level to try to move the ball. You may have ad hoc coalitions, and again, we've seen some of them already in the last 2 years, in the period where the US kind of dropped the mantle of being the international leader, for better or for worse. European countries trying to salvage the Iran nuclear deal despite the United States, countries trying to salvage the Paris Climate Change Accord without and despite the United States, trying to salvage the Trans-Pacific Partnership, again, without and despite the United States. So I think there are, and sometimes despite and without other great powers, but there are ways perhaps to think of a future in which there'll be more of an a la carte of multilateralism, where countries come together and try to do what cannot be done anymore, perhaps, at least for some time, at an international level. And to focus on the area of the world that, as I said earlier, I know the Sharq Foundation focuses a lot in the Middle East, there may well be, and this is more hope than prediction, an ability for countries in the region, realizing that the competition between outside powers has not been to their benefit, that they're not getting the protection that they may have expected from some, and that the interference from the outside is putting them in greater danger than it is providing protection. Maybe you could have an effort in the Middle East to develop something like the OSCE, the Helsinki process, where Gulf Arab countries and Iran and others try to come together to build a security architecture, something that Crisis Group has advocated. So I think we're in a period, and this is, there's a lot of pessimism that's around. There's a lot of fear that the collapse of the old order is going to give rise to more chaos and more conflict and more bloodshed, all of which is very possible. And as I've mentioned, we're seeing some examples of it already, but there are also opportunities in the loss of and the collapse of an order that I'll say it again, has not only meant good news for many parts of the world. So I think we're in a tug of war right now. I'll conclude with this thought. I think there is a tug of war going on between various narratives. Again, some of the three options that were mentioned, I will put them in sort of two buckets. There's a narrative out there that is saying, as a result of COVID-19, now is the time to look inward. Now is the time to really focus on internal exigencies, economic or other, and to be more cautious about and worried about the outside world. And then there's another that is trying to build areas of cooperation, whether it's scientific cooperation to come up with a new vaccine or new therapies to deal with COVID-19, or to share the burden of the economic crisis to make sure that the countries that are hardest hit will get the assistance that they need. And out of that tug of war and many others, again, many of the other streams and threads that Fabrizio mentioned, a new order will emerge. And I think it will be up to all actors, states, non-government actors, protest movements around the world, to define that order in a way that will be more inclusive, more equitable, and less violent than the one that we are exiting.
All right, wonderful. Wow, thank you very much indeed, Robert, for that. I think this is going amazing so far. We are truly enriched, I think, with a lot of ideas. So once again, a reminder to the audience following this, get your questions ready, jot them down. Soon we'll get to the Q&A session where you can either send them through the chat box or press the raise hand button. All right, so last but not least, as they say, it's now time to hear from our final speaker, the president of a Sharq Forum, Mr. Waddah Khalfa. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sami, Fabrizio, Rob. And I agree with you, Rob, that we should not be nostalgic at all for the current world order, which is, in my opinion, has done major injustice to many parts of the world. The one that we are in, the Middle East, has suffered more than any other maybe region from the illiberal, as you said, the non-liberal, actually liberal order. And I cannot but actually start noticing new patterns emerging, which, in my opinion, are trying to pick up on what happened in the First World War rather than the Second World War. If the United Nations was created after the Second World War to create much better and just world, in fact, our region, the Middle East, is picking up on the First World War rather than the second one. And I cannot but actually notice during the last few months how new patterns are emerging in the region. the Ottomans left Libya, the last region that the Ottomans lost in North Africa was Libya. And that was in 1911, 1912 to the Italians at that time, just before the First World War. And the last war that happened between the Russians and the Ottomans was not very far from that time. And the Russians have been always thinking of coming back to the Mediterranean and trying to find a control over the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus for their geopolitical necessities related to the Black Sea and so on. When I see the Russians at this moment in time, strengthening their presence in Syria and having a base in Libya, while the Ottomans, the Turks in this case, are actually coming back as well to Libya, I see that there are things that do not change with time. The Sazonov-Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was agreed upon in 1916 to divide the legacy of the Ottoman territories amongst Russia, France, and Britain, I see it actually still alive in a sense in front of us, although 100 years almost have or more have passed, but that was actually something interesting to notice. And also in my readings, I found something very interesting. When Stalin wanted to, when he had talks in Yalta with Churchill and with Roosevelt, he was trying to convince them to establish a base in Libya at that time. And again, I can understand why, because the Russians needed to have their presence in the Mediterranean and to secure the passage to the Turkish strains as well in order to reach the Black Sea. So the current international world order is at this moment in time going through major shift and change. It is a moment in the history of the world where a lot of trends could emerge, but to help us navigating through or trying to find out and to forecast the new trends that might emerge, in my opinion, there are issues that normally do not change, which is related to the geopolitical and the strategic needs of certain states and actors. Since the United States of America, at this moment in time, is focusing more on China, which might become a major trend in the next few years to come, and that might be intensified and accelerated as well, it means that the custodian of the so-called post-Second World War world order is in fact going to have another interest, which is good news for us. So we are not mourning. And I don't think that people in the developing countries and in the Middle East in particular should really feel that they are missing a lot, because that world order was not just, as far as we are concerned, it was not actually giving us or kind to us, because it has created a lot of inconsistencies, created a lot of injustice in our territories. Our land has been, in a way or another, not only colonized, but also shaped based on a Western interest, which we were not consulted about, and we did not even have any interest in. And during the last 20 years, we have lost more than 5 million people who have been killed in our region, and more than that of refugees who have been as well replaced from their homes. And this is another example why that world order actually was not good. When I'm reading now for some of the historians and the reformers in our region, I think I reached the following conclusion. The last 100 years, the last century was the century of humiliation for our region in particular. And of course, I borrow that terminology from the Chinese century of humiliation. But in fact, our region from 1917 until today went through major humiliation. 1917, our land was divided between the British and the French. And in 1917, Balfour gave the Balfour Declaration promising Palestine to the Jews as a homeland at that time, and between the new borders decided by foreign powers and the fact that Israel was formed in 1948, between these two, the new identity of this region was shaped. And until now, the tension created between these two major incidents led to a situation where we have paid a lot of chaotic and a lot of miserable, actually, reality in our region. Based on that, can I ask the following question? Is the shift which we are witnessing right now in the international world order is positive or could be positive to us or not? Given the current reality, as I see it today, of course, it is not actually very promising. Right now, the Arab world in particular is going through major problems. You see the civil wars happening almost everywhere. Our capitals have been destroyed. Our historical cities have been demolished. Our culture, which has been for centuries revolving around societies and societal strength and tolerance, is actually right now is replaced by brutality in certain areas and countries. The minorities and the majorities, the Shia and the Sunnah, Muslims and non-Muslims, all these kind of issues have risen as major challenge to our reality. But I would say and argue also, on the other hand, that this current reality is a product of a century which has led us to the current reality. And this century has put the seeds of brutality and the seeds of the collapse of the state and the seed of lack of legitimacy in our states after independence states, and we have never recovered from that. Can a new world order reshape this? It depends on us. It depends on us, and I will take Fabrizio's argument that we need to build something that springs from within people, within the interest of people, that is diverse, not Western-centric, that takes into consideration that this world, as we are moving forward in a globalized technological and climate change and many other challenges that we are going to face, this world, if it is going to be just, if all of us going to succeed in building a much better reality, then all of us should participate in it. The Western-centric approach to building a world order was disastrous. And I think this 100 years has proven that a lot of the developing countries, in particular in Africa and in Asia and in Latin America, did not really get the benefits that Western countries got during the last century. And the greed of brutal capitalism, the greed of powers that had forced to impose their will on other nations has created these complications that we are going through. So yes, we need new thinking. We need a new imagination. We need also to quit from the security-centered approach to international politics and to quit from the wealth creation and amassing approach in order to create something more just and more equitable, and at the same time, something that truly representative of globalized culture, rather than of Western culture that has been globalized in politics and economics in order to make sure that eventually the spoils of the world order goes back to the capitals of the West during the last at least 100 years. So there is a great opportunity here that we need to build on. This is why, in my opinion, we need to have an alliance, a new alliance. This alliance should not spring from the balance of power, or usual game that normally states act upon, but also from powers in the society, cultural, social, societal powers that could come together, global ones. Now we have the means to talk to each other. When Palestine, for example, in 1917 was under mandate by the British, or when Syria was created at that time, the borders of Syria and Iraq were drawn by Sykes and Picot at that time, we could not know this. We did not know. I mean, what is interesting about Sykes-Picot, we knew that Sykes-Picot existed in 1917, 1 year later after it was signed by Sazonov and Sykes and Picot, and only we knew that when the Bolshevik Revolution took place in Russia, and they stormed the offices of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they found the documents. While the Arabs at that time, Sharif Hussein of Mecca and King Fuad of Egypt and Al Saud of Saudi Arabia, they were still dreaming of an Arab kingdom or an Arab Khilafat or an Arab empire. And the British were still promising them that this is going to happen. 1 year later only, we knew that they have been lying to us and everything already has been decided. Today, I think there is power of knowledge happening. And there is also power of communication amongst like-minded people across the world, not only in the Arab world or the Islamic world, but across the world. This is why value-centered approach to the future is necessary at this stage, at least. When we have that, and when we share force together across the world to shape that kind of imagination, then we may start to envisage what is going to happen after this transition period. It's going to be chaotic, it's not going to be peaceful, it's not going to be fantastic. The next few years are not going to be easy economically or politically, but at least we as intellectuals or advocates of justice and human rights should start to spend proper time envisaging a world which is not based on the same foundations that the last 100 years the world order was based on. And we can pick up on that and we can introduce new movements, I mean international movements within all capitals in the world that could really start spreading these ideas. Eventually, liberalism, for example, emerged as an intellectual movement, then eventually was materialized through approach adopted by states. But now that approach has failed and has reached its end. Maybe we have to think of something else. And as Fabrizio spoke about the challenges that we are going to face, all of us are going to face. We are going to face the challenge of climate. It's not going to be only something that the West is going to suffer from, every one of us. We are going to face the challenge of technology, the challenge of the new innovations, the information technology, the new basics of ethics that we are going to build this new world, which all of us are going to face equally almost. Yes, more in the West, but also everyone else very soon is going to be part of it. So what we can start with today is not exactly what the world started in 1917 or 1945. So we might be much better connected. We might understand each other and each other's needs and shared interests more than the forefathers of this world order have understood. And therefore, we can really move into something more solid, I hope. But again, as I said, I shouldn't be very optimistic at this moment in time, because it seems to me some suffering is still ahead of us before we could reach that moment of equilibrium. Thank you very much, Sam.
Okay, wonderful. So we've had the positive outlooks, and then we got the cold shower, shall we say, from Mr. Comfort there at the end, and the realistic, perhaps, check-in with reality. That's wonderful. We have a wonderful panel of projections and visions for how we move forward. I just want to remind everyone, as we thank all the panelists thus far for their interjections, we're moving closer now to the point where the audience can ask your questions. So please start jotting down and sending in your questions. You can send it in, as I said, either through the chat box, or you'll find a button in which you can raise your hand, and that way we'll know that you want to ask a question audiovisually as well. Please make sure when you send your question in that you mention your name, your professional affiliation, and most importantly, who you want to address the question to. All right, so while we're perhaps building up for questions, I want to put a question to the panel, and it's a point that actually Rob raised, which is that we might see perhaps new instruments, an OSCE, as he put it, of the Gulf world or the Arab world, to emerge and try and put forward a new framework for international cooperation. I'm curious to know, Mr. Wandah's perspective of whether the Arab world, given all the weaknesses you've outlined and the challenges still ahead, has the strength to put together an OSCE or something like that, and to shape its own future destiny in the post-COVID era.
You are asking me or Rob?
I took the point from Rob, and I'd like to put it to you.
Okay, so given the current reality, I don't think so. Unfortunately, right now, as I said, we are still going. I think most of our countries, most of our governments in this region are still living the old world order. They are still tied to the Americans. They are still run by Jared Kushner and Trump and the kind of ups and downs happening there. They couldn't understand how to build something springs from the region for the people of the region. We don't have a geopolitical center at this moment in time. So we are still fighting old game, in my opinion. None of that is in the interest of our people in this region, or the interest even of these actors who are operating on these kind of, most of them are actually irrelevant fights that we are going through, especially in the Arab world at this moment in time. So we are going to witness around us new patterns emerging. When I see the Eastern Mediterranean reshaping the balance of power of the region, when I see the Turks building their base in Libya, when I see the Russians acting as a regional power right now and becoming part of shaping this region as well, then definitely a new pattern is going to emerge. When I see the Israelis trying to take the moment and benefit from the current chaotic situation and reshaping the rules of the game by annexing or trying to annex some territories, it shows me that the old way of doing business is not valid anymore. Something new has to emerge. But I don't really see a lot of strategic thinking taking place in the Arab world. I don't see a good definition of national security emerging in most of the big capitals in the Arab world. I see people still, as I said, fighting personal fights, which are not, in a way or another, very useful for the future, to say the least. And I would assume that the big countries of the region in the Arab world, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, Algeria, all these big countries at this moment in time are saturated with troubles and complications that are not allowing them to envisage something regional where we could cooperate and build for the interest of everyone. It seems to me that they cannot have that choice at this moment in time. But my projection is the following. People will never take this forever, because economically we are going to suffer. And everyone now see that all these futile fights are not actually useful for anyone. And therefore, a pressure will mount up whereby leaders are going to be forced to take new approach. And I hope in the next few years, a new reasonable approach to our region will emerge. And of course, as you know, Sharq Forum is advocating the idea of regional cooperation based on shared interest, which I hope not very far from now, that the region, the Arab world, Turkey, Iran, could really share interest and sit together and resolve all these kind of problems which are really tearing this region apart.
Okay, that's an interesting point. I want to take it to Fabrizio, if I may. And Fabrizio, when you were talking about one of the scenarios is a reinvigorated and reimagined multilateralism, given the sort of weaknesses in some regions, particularly here in the MENA, which Mr. Khanfar has outlined, does that reinvigorated and reimagined multilateralism become any more democratic in the sense that regions are having a bigger ability to have a say in putting the new international cooperation together? Or do we fall simply into maybe we're using new institutions and tools, but again, a similar pattern of where the strong and the mighty are the ones ultimately who put together the next international system of international cooperation?
Well, I think we have to distinguish between what would be desirable and the way things may work out if current megatrends continue.
What do you think will happen?
I think there is a general trend globally. I'm not talking about the Middle East, but globally towards greater empowerment of regional organizations. And we've seen the AU in the African continent take the forefront in peacemaking, peace negotiation efforts over other actors. The European Union has had many ups and downs, but it generally is moving towards greater consolidation. And then sub-regional organizations, ECOWAS in the west of Africa is growing, has had a lot of very effective peacekeeping in its own region. And the Secretary General has advocated for more networked multilateralism. I think it's, but you know, there has been a resurgence of big power politics, and that's very clear. And that I think that is not contingent on this or that administration. I think, as Rob indicated, those are deeper trends that are likely to remain with us. But the power of all these regional organizations, and this is why in other regions, notably the Middle East, or for that matter in the Americas, they haven't got so far, is because getting unity among their respective members has been difficult. And then too often, sometimes they're also competing regional organizations within the same region. So that I think that the weight and power of regional organizations is proportionate to the level of unity that can be gained among its membership. But I think I don't think it's an either or. I think we'll see an interplay of both in the years to come. But the Secretary General definitely wants to take the United Nations in the direction of strengthened alliances and devolution of capacity to regional organizations, which I think can be very effective in regional, in conflict solving. I mean, the way the region came together around Colombia, where I led the UN efforts for some years, was very decisive in helping bring the conflict to an end. So for certain challenges, regional organizations can be absolutely key, and conflict is one of them. But there are other challenges like climate change, like disruptive effects of new technologies, for which regional organizations will always need to also act in concert with universal approaches. So I think even the strengthening, the highly desirable strengthening of regional approaches will not obviate the need for also, for a different set of problems, having very strong universal approaches for a certain set of problems as well.
All right, wonderful. You made a point there about the future of alliances like the EU, and we actually have a question now for Mr. Robert Malley from Mohammed Shafiq Hakimi, who's following us, about the EU, and he's noting that during the peak of the COVID-19, the EU were not really willing to help each other, Rob. You know, what's your vision, I think is what he's trying to ask about how EU countries are going to move forward. Are we going to see them, you know, the alliance break down in cooperation more?
So I don't think there's a black or white answer. In fact, in the early stages of the COVID-19 saw...
Sorry, Rob, I'm going to ask you to move closer to the mic again.
I'm sorry. I'm saying, I think if the picture is not black and white, I think if in the early stages of the pandemic, the EU seemed caught in its divisions, which have been exacerbated of late between geographic north and south and east and west. I think in the latter stages, we actually saw something pretty positive from the EU, where they agreed to use some of to raise the collective funds to benefit the countries that needed it most. So I think Chancellor Merkel, President Macron of France made an effort that was surprising to some, given the trends that had preceded it. So I think the jury is still out as to how the EU is going to emerge. Clearly, it's going through and has been going through a lot of tensions and crises over immigration, over economic redistribution and inequality. But as I said, I think we've seen some positive signals. If I could just say one word to the question you were asking Wada earlier, based on what I had said, I don't think we disagreed that much in terms of the Middle East and in terms of where we are today. I mean, I'm not an optimist. I would call myself a piss optimist. I try to be realistic, but then looking for hope where it exists. I think the reason why I see some elements, some potential elements, and I don't mean today, but over the coming period, is that I think both sides if we want to simplify the conflict between Iran and its allies and Saudi Arabia and its allies, both sides have seen the limitations or realizing the limitations of their current approach. Iran, I think, has bumped into a wall when it comes to some of its regional aspirations, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Lebanon. It's also facing a significant economic crisis. And Saudi Arabia has discovered that the US, for all its vaunted power, wasn't the protector that it hoped it would be when its oil fields were attacked at Upcake. So I think both sides may come to greater realism. And in this sense, it almost doesn't matter who's elected in the US. I think with President Trump, the limitations of his willingness to intervene on behalf of Gulf Arab countries has been shown. And a President Biden is going to have many other preoccupations, and the Middle East is not going to be at the top of that list. So I'm talking about a period of time during which regional actors, Arab and Iran and perhaps Turkey and others, will have to conclude that if they don't come together to try to secure and to arrange their region, it will not be done for them by the outside, and they may well be more threatened than they thought that they might have been a few years ago.
I'm curious to know, well, picking up on that, is there a possibility for non-state actors in weakened regions, whether it's Latin America or MENA, weakened in the sense where the traditional state actors appear, as you so eloquently outlined, to be quite weakened? I don't know, is technology giving an opportunity for non-state actors more to get in on shaping the new international cooperation system? Did you manage to hear me? Oh, I think we need to unmute you. There we go.
Okay.
Okay.
So, as I said, now we are in a phase, in my opinion, where our new trends are emerging. And I can sense in the Arab world the new awareness. We should not undermine what happened in 2011. 2011 was a major turning point in the awareness in the Arab world. We have gone through the Arab Spring, and after that, we have failed to create a new reality. In fact, a lot of countries that went through the Arab Spring later on went through a lot of chaotic transition, which is still continuing on. But that important lesson of the 2011 has not gone in vain. In my opinion, there is a new debate, there is a new discussion, there is a new awareness. There is a recognition of the need for new modes of thinking and new narrative that could secure the future. And this is, I see it everywhere. I see the debate amongst the young people in particular emerging everywhere. And when I mean that, I mean in you. I mean all the trends of thought in the Arab world, starting from the pro-Arab nationalism to the secular, to the Islamic trend of thinking. All of that is going through major transformation. and introspection. The region itself right now has realized, as Rob said, I think everyone has reached a moment where, okay, now there is a stalemate. No one can really, win the final battle. And therefore, this stalemate, once recognized by the players, some of them are still not mature enough to recognize the stalemate. Some of them are still living the illusion that they might, with a little bit of American support or Israeli support or more weapons here and there or more fights here and there, they can win. In my opinion, very soon they will realize with the transition, the international world order and the lack of focus. The American actually, in my opinion, was good about all of this, that the Americans are losing interest in the region. The oil is not the most important factor right now, which is great news to us. Once the Americans reduce their interest in the region, and once this region finds itself facing a new reality and finding that they need to forge a new balance of power and to realize their potential, maybe that is a good start point, because the American interference and the Western powers in general have given an illusion to some weak parties or some small countries in this region that they can do much more what their national interest determines or their weight in the balance of power determine. So they have to think in a new paradigm. But this is yet to come. I hope soon they will start realizing that.
Unmute myself. All right, we have some more questions coming in. We have a question, here we go, from Sahar Zaki concerning the UN. So I think it's addressed to Mr. Fabrizio, asking about basically the evaluation of the UN, since we're seeing increasing crises around the world, but we're not seeing an increasing ability. We're seeing perhaps a decreasing ability to solve and address them. Where is that leaving institutions like the UN, do you think, in the future going forward?
I think the UN's, I've dedicated over 30 years of my life to the UN, so I won't pretend to be objective. And I've worked in every region, including for UNRWA in the occupied territories. I think the UN's record is very mixed. I think in some areas it's consistently tended to perform better than in other areas. I think recently on the political front, it's had a great deal of difficulty at bringing about conflict resolution. And I think part of that is owing to disunity, the new disunity or increased disunity in the Security Council. The stalemate that's existed over Syria for 8 years has led to the bloodiest conflict we know in recent times. Having said that, I think in other situations, the UN's presence has stopped conflicts from growing worse. In South Sudan, where I've served, in Central Africa, where I've served, there's no question that the presence of the UN played some role in stopping conflicts escalating further. But as conflicts have also grown regionalized, as is the case, as was mentioned, in Yemen, in Syria, with the interplay of global politics, the resolution gets much more difficult. And something we haven't talked about, but I think is a growing factor that is often underestimated by political actors or political think tanks or people like ourselves, is the economic reasoning behind conflict. I worked in Colombia for a long time, and in Central Africa for that matter, and in former Yugoslavia. And in all three places, a major underestimated element was just who was profiting from conflict. Conflict, the absence of the rule of law, the absence of central state power is a very, very lucrative business model. And I think that's something that is often underestimated. And I think that, I mean, Rob is and others around this on this panel are much greater experts than I am about the region. But to the best of my knowledge, it's a major factor in Libya as well. And there, the sort of state model of conflict resolution, which is all about throwing men together in a room and getting them to agree on common interests, is not a very effective model. I mean, it simply doesn't work. So I think there are many. I think the UN has a mixed record. I think rivalry on the Security Council does not help improve our record. And I think the multidimensional and complex drivers of conflict, which we as a political organization aren't always sufficiently mindful of, can also hinder us in having the tools and know how to resolve it. But
Fabrizio, if I may, you make a very good point about the economic interests. Is there any reason to believe that these economic interests might shape themselves differently in the period going forward to avoid conflict or to encourage new mechanisms of international cooperation? How do you read the economic landscape that you're clearly quite familiar with?
I guess one has to distinguish. I mean, Mr. Shafar alluded to, interests in oil. So, I mean, there are, for lack of a better word, overt, licit economic interests. Then there are illicit economies, the growth of illicit economies, the trafficking in people, drug crime, weapon smuggling, extortion, illegal mining, which all depend on licit economic interests, depend on having powers in place which are friendly with you and will help award you the contracts you want. Illicit economic interests, and of course I'm simplifying a very complex matter, depend upon the absence of power structures, the absence of the rule of law, the absence of accountability, so that your business model can flourish. And I think it's particular that latter aspect that we insufficiently understand, and that our conflict resolution models are inefficiently equipped to adequately address. I mean, in Central Africa, just to give one example, we had endless peace negotiations with different armed groups on the assumption that they had political interests, and those meetings would be helpful in finding common ground around political interests. But they were, in many cases, driven by economic interests, and no end of discussions around political interests was going to lead them to take measures that were absolutely alien to their business model and economic interests. And I think that's something that and of course it's not black and white, there's an interplay often, but that's something that we need to understand and get much more sophisticated about responding to. And there, having sharper tools to uphold the rule of law, and understand and track international capital flows and the reach of organized crime, and much better cross-border cooperation in dealing with it, I think is vital.
All right, there's a question here. I want to from Ziad Al-Hajj Muhammad. If I could give it actually to Rob. As the US declines, could China fill the void that the US will leave in the MENA? And if so, to what extent?
I think it's one of the unknowns that we're facing. I mean, what's been interesting so far is that China has gotten involved to some extent, mainly in the Horn of Africa and therefore to some extent in the Gulf, but it has really steered clear principally of the Middle East, probably on the theory that it was already overcrowded, and secondly, that there was nothing much to gain. Looking at the experience of the United States and of others, involvement in the Middle East has not been profitable either politically, diplomatically, or militarily, or economically. So maybe they've been the wiser of all the great powers in deciding to steer clear. But of course, they do have a dependency on Gulf oil, and to the extent that the U.S. withdraws from the region, and I really would put a cautionary note when people speak about U.S. retrenchment. Let's bear in mind that U.S. troop presence in the Middle East has grown by 20,000 people since President Trump came into office and said that he was going to move away from the region. President Obama said he was going to pivot away from the Middle East to Asia. So I think, we're far from the U.S. abandoning the region. But as the U.S., if it does step back, as there is pressure mounting in the U.S. to do so because of other priorities, because of the legacy of failed intervention in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, which cost a lot to the people in the region, but the U.S. looks back and says, why did we get involved in most of these and be involved for so long? Then maybe China will be forced to get more involved in order to protect its access to resources. But again, I think it is striking that it has not gotten involved in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in the Syrian conflict, in the Yemeni conflict. It is for the most part steered clear. I think it's going to face a whole host of questions in the future. I'll end on this. I think as a growing power, it so far has not really assumed global responsibility as a actor in different conflicts to try to end them, to try to shape them in certain ways. As its responsibilities grow, as its international investments grow, as its interest in stability grows, it may well find that it's going to have to be more involved than it has been so far. We've seen signs of it. I'm sure Fabrizio has seen it when he was in Sudan. We've seen it in Zimbabwe. We see it to some extent in Venezuela, where they have economic interests. And I think it's an absolutely critical.
Rob, if I can latch on a comment that you made, which is kind of related to this. Earlier, you talked about countries are trying to salvage some of the initiatives of multilateralism or international cooperation, such as Paris Climate Accords and so on, in the absence of the US. So is your vision that these countries can come together, or these, even if we're not talking about states, parts of the world can come together and can forge a meaningful international cooperation without the world's largest economy and superpower? Or do you think that eventually the US is going to, quote unquote, come back into the fold? Briefly.
Well, again, I don't think the US is out of the fold. I think we have to be careful. As I said, they still are very active. But I think the point I'm trying to make is there are instances where I think you're going to see ad hoc coalition of countries. We've seen some already come together when they feel they have to do so because the multilateral international system is not working to those ends. And I think we've seen that, and we are likely to see more as we continue in this transitional period.
All right, wonderful. I think what we're going to do now is I'd like to give each of the speakers an opportunity to speak for 1 minute to address one point, if you'd be all so kind, and that is your advice to youth activists in the region. This is a request that's come through. What would be your advice to youth in the region, how they can navigate the uncertainty and steer themselves towards a more positive, inclusive trajectory that the world really needs? Maybe we'll start with Mr. Khanfar. In 1 minute, your advice on that point to the youth, sir. Make sure I unmute you.
Yes, we actually, the youth in our region, need to adapt to the new reality. They need to understand what happened to them during the last few years, to study it carefully, to come up with lessons. What happened to us was not the end of the world. It is not the end of hope. We are still in the process of struggling for a much better future. We should not give up. And because we don't want to give up, and we have no choice even to give up, we need to understand exactly where things went wrong. How could we come together? How could we build a new narrative, new imagination? How could we really link our reality with the world and take notice of this great transition that the world system is going through. Therefore, we can start imagining not only idealistic future, but a future which achieves to us what we have been aspiring for during the last 100 years, but also it is a realistic world that we can build our hope in reality, in coalition with like-minded people who share values, and they are willing to build with us this new reality, not in our region, but in the rest of the world as well.
Okay, wonderful. So learn, imagine, don't give up. In 1 minute, Robert Malley, your advice to the youth in the region.
I really don't think it's up to me to give advice to the youth of the region. I'm either young or from the region, but what I can say, and you know, I think the best advice is to do better than the generations that preceded them. My father was Egyptian, and he saw and came of age at a time of great hope in the post-independence period, and he saw the failure both of the Arab state systems and of the Arab world as a whole. And I think that's something, you know, one would hope that lessons would be learned from it. Is my only message, to the extent again that it has any validity, is in the end, all these questions, if we are in a transitional period, it all comes down to human agency, to people taking matters in their own hands. I think it was Wadao Fabrizio who mentioned new forms of activism. I see it in my country with Black Lives Matter, which has really made some, you know, extraordinary changes in terms of public perception, at least in a matter of very short time. I think there are new forms of activism, of which I am, again, not the person to give any lessons or teachings about, but there are new forms of activism, of transnational solidarity, of ways of communicating, of ways of sharing both values and information. And as I said, I'm not an optimist, but I'm not a pessimist either, because I think ultimately it comes down to the willpower of ordinary people.
All right, thank you very much, Rob. And now, in 1 minute, Fabrizio, your turn, sir, please, to share your wisdom.
I would wholeheartedly agree with what's been said by Mr. Hamfar and Rob completely. I would add that at the UN now, we're trying to get advice from youth rather than give advice to youth. And that's very much the initiative I'm leading, is what the Secretary General calls a global listening tour, where we really want to hear from youth what they think our priorities should be in international cooperation, in the UN in particular, what their biggest fears are, what their biggest hopes are, and how they wish to see us improve. So my plea would be, let us hear you, make your voices known, you know, join our initiative, fill out our survey. That's the easiest, quickest way of doing it. And I would underline what Rob said. I think there are many people, nobody's alone. There are many like-minded people around, where like-minded people come together within their sphere of influence that then adds up as more people come on board. Change is still possible, but help us be the change you want by making us know how you would like to see us improve. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. A big thanks to all of our speakers thus far. A big thanks to our Sharq for putting this event together and all of those who've worked behind the scenes. And thank you for involving me in this. I think I'll hand over now, final 2-minute closing remarks from Mr. Khanfar, the President of Sharq. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. And actually, we are glad to have this conversation. And as I said in my remarks, and as everyone has actually agreed upon, maybe one of the most important things that this COVID-19 has introduced to us, the ability to imagine something new, the necessity to come together. And what we would like to do here, especially in this region, in the Middle East and North Africa, is to concentrate more and more on the flowing notion that we are not alone. There are many people across the world who are also trying to imagine a new world, much better world, and we could share forces and we could work together And that definitely will fill everyone's heart with hope. Otherwise, if we are left alone or anyone is left alone, they might feel besieged by complications. And definitely this region during the last few years has gone through major traumas. And I think now we are imagining something new, but that something new is not going to be entirely built by our people in this region, but by everyone. So I thank everyone for their remarks, and I hope that الشرق will continue hosting such great events. In fact, this session is organized by our youth network. And I would like to say something to our young guys who are following us everywhere in the world. And as Fabrizio has said, we need your wisdom, and we need your strength, and we need your courage. And the more we, those who have participated in the old, the more we feel pessimists on major issues, you should introduce to us alternatives, ideas, optimistic notions, hope, and take from us the best that we have done, but also don't at all feel reluctant to be critical and feel reluctant to tell us where things went wrong, because the future is yours. Thank you very much.